Olympus.
Thank you for choosing the Olympus E500. You'll find it a reliable tool for taking high-quality pictures. Please note that the contents of this DVD are no substitute for the detailed operating instructions enclosed. The first part of this presentation will help you to become familiar with the basic operating elements of the camera. In the second part, you will learn how to master common photographic situations with the E500. Fit the lens by aligning the mounting marks on the lens and on the body, then turning it clockwise until it clicks into position. On the bottom of the camera is the battery compartment for the lithium-ion rechargeable battery BLM1 or the battery holder LBH1 for 3 CR123A disposable batteries. Open the lid on the bottom of the camera and insert the rechargeable battery or the battery holder. On the right of the camera, you'll find the slot for memory cards. The E500 can be used with compact flash cards, micro drives or XD picture cards. When you switch the camera on after fitting the battery, you'll notice a blue diode flashing briefly in a rapid sequence next to the program selection disc. This is the SSWF indicator. SSWF stands for Supersonic Wave Filter. A major problem when changing lenses on single-lens reflex cameras is the intrusion of dust into the camera and/or onto the CCD. The supersonic wave filter located in front of the CCD removes particles of dirt from the filter by means of ultrasonic vibration and then catches them on a specially coated film. All over the camera body you will see white and green symbols. The white symbols always refer to recording functions, while the green stand for replay functions. The button with the red recycle bin is used for deleting pictures. The program selection disc is essentially divided into two areas. In the top half, you'll find the settings for full automatic, program automatic, time and aperture automatic, and for the full manual exposure setting of the E500. In the lower half of the setting wheel are the settings for different motif programs: portrait, landscape, macro, sport, and night portrait modes. These settings ensure that the correct presets are always ready for the corresponding situations, while still allowing you to select some settings yourself. If you set the selection disc to Scene, you can choose in the menu from 15 different photo situations, and the camera automatically carries out the settings required. Almost all photographic situations imaginable are represented in the Scene menu. You can't make any adjustments here, but on the other hand you've nothing to worry about and can concentrate fully on your picture. In the Viewfinder, you can always see the most important function displays for your photo. In the middle of the Viewfinder is the indication of which AF metering field is currently active. You can select the AF metering field by pressing the AF metering selection button once and then choosing the field you want with the wheel. If you activate all three metering fields, the camera selects the optimum metering field. The wheel in the program selection disc is one of the central control elements of the E500. This is where you select settings in both record and playback modes. 3 autofocus modes are available with the E500: single autofocus, continuous autofocus, and manual focus, plus single and continuous autofocus both in combination with manual focus. Static autofocus is suitable for stationary subjects. In this mode you can save the focus with the shutter release button half pressed. You can also use static autofocus in combination with manual focus. This permits you to correct the focus manually while you hold the release half pressed. Continuous focus is suitable for moving objects. The camera follows the focus as long as the release button is half pressed. In CAF plus MF mode, you focus first, release the button again, and can then adjust the focus. Naturally, it's also possible to focus the picture completely manually. On the right, next to the viewfinder image, you will see the aperture value in the first line of the LCD display, and directly beneath it the exposure time. If one of these displays starts to flash when the button is half pressed, there's an under or over exposure. The small circle here stands for the AF confirmation, which also informs you by flashing if the camera can't focus. On the right, next to the AF confirmation, is the flash readiness symbol. You can flip the flash unit up by pressing the flash lock button. When the flash is fully charged, the display lights continuously. The following flash modes are available: auto, red eye effect reduction, fill-in flash, long exposure synchronization combined with red eye reduction, long exposure synchronization to the first and second shutter curtain, and flash switched off. The WB indicator appears in the display when the white balance is not set to automatic. You can adjust the white balance by pressing the WB button and turning the wheel. There's also an instant white balance function. Take a sheet of white paper and hold it format filling in front of the camera. Press the instant white balance button in conjunction with the shutter release and then OK. In the E500, however, other functions can also be assigned to this button. In addition to the white balance function, 3 other functions are also available. In the setting Test Exposure, a test picture is taken without this being immediately saved to the card. If the Preview function is assigned to the button, the depth of field preview is activated by the instant white balance button. By pressing the button, you can simulate the real depth of field impression of the final exposure. Here, the viewfinder image is correspondingly darkened, and you can judge the depth of field exactly in advance. In My Mode, you can call up the personal settings saved in the My Mode menu by pressing the button. The AEL indicator informs you whether you have locked the exposure. You can activate the exposure lock by pressing the AEL button directly next to the viewfinder. Use the AE memory if you wish to lock the exposure or the focus for the desired picture composition. The menu contains many setting options for this purpose. The next viewfinder indicator provides information on the exposure correction, which is activated with the button above the shutter release. You can make exposure corrections from -5 to +5 exposure values in 1/3 steps. Below this is the symbol for the charge status of the rechargeable battery, which flashes as soon as the battery power is insufficient. The type of exposure metering mode is shown on the left next to the battery symbol. You can choose from 5 metering methods: digital ESP metering, center-weighted integral metering, spot metering, and light shade-based spot metering. In the case of ESP metering, no symbol appears in the viewfinder. The ESP metering system consists of 49 metering fields in which the light is separately measured. This precise method of exposure metering is suitable for most situations and ensures well-balanced exposure, even in high-contrast conditions. Center-weighted integral metering is a classic of single-lens reflex photography. As opposed to the ESP mode, center-weighted metering lays more weight on the values measured at the center of the image. Here, most of the exposure information comes from the center of the image. But measurements of fields away from the center are also taken into account to produce an average value. In the case of spot metering, only the light in the center cross of the viewfinder is metered. This is ideal, for example, for motifs with strong backlighting. Light shade-based spot metering is used for adjustment to bright and dark areas. In the bottom line, the viewfinder shows which exposure mode the camera is in. You can change the ISO setting of the camera easily by pressing the ISO button and setting the desired value with the wheel. As standard, the settings Auto, 100, 200 and 400 ISO are available. In the menu, however, the range can be extended to ISO 1600. Higher ISO values are useful if, for example, you do not wish to use flash in dark surroundings. Another problem in digital photography is the noise which occurs in long exposures. To deal with this, the E500 is equipped with a noise reduction system, which cuts in at exposure times of 2 seconds or more. On the left, you can see an image with noise reduction switched on, and on the right, an image without. The new 2.5-inch LCD monitor of the E500 has 3 display options in record mode, which can be switched by pressing the Info button: a standard display showing the most important picture information, and a detailed display of the photo settings available. When the button is pressed again, the display is switched off. All basic functions of the E500 can be read from the LCD display and can also be set in combination with the buttons and setting dials you've just learned about. That means you can operate the camera easily without having to activate the menu. Further camera functions can be set using the simple menu operation. When the menu button is pressed, the menu appears logically structured from left to right. The subdivisions include 2 record, 1 playback and 2 setup menus. As an example, we'd like to show you a very useful menu function, the reset function. When you've adjusted all the functions and settings on your new camera, and now do not want to restore every setting step by step, simply navigate to the first record menu using the arrow buttons until the symbol for the first record menu is highlighted in green. Now press the right arrow button once downwards and then right until reset appears. Select OK and then with the arrow button Yes and then press OK again. You've now restored the camera to its factory settings. In other words, your E500 is now in the same configuration as when you first switched it on. You've already begun to get to know your new camera in the first part. The second part is intended to help you to put into practice the possibilities the E500 offers you. For successful photos, do not just depend on good equipment, but also on the photographer. Digital SLR photography has enormously enhanced the possibilities for the realization of creative photo ideas. The E-system from Olympus stands out here in particular. It combines the creative freedom familiar to analog photography with the advantages of digital technology. The 4/3 standard provides the basis for professional image quality. The high-quality and high-resolution Zuiko digital objectives for this standard are specially calculated for the sensors in the camera of the E-system. With the Olympus E-system, or within the 4/3 standard, the same angle of view as in 35mm photography is achieved at half the focal length. This means, among other things, that there is no focal length extension, and there are fewer problems with vignetting. The ultrafine resolution of the 4/3 lenses is the guarantee that the performance of the image sensors can be fully utilized. The exposure of a photo is determined by 2 factors: the time for which the shutter is opened to allow the light to fall on the CCD, and the aperture size, which determines how much light falls on the CCD in this time. Please note that small f numbers stand for large apertures and vice versa. Here you see a typical f number series. The aperture size is doubled from one number to the next. So these 2 factors, the shutter speed and the aperture, determine the exposure value. There's a nice example which makes this relationship clear. Imagine the CCD as a bucket to be filled with water. Here the diameter of the pipe represents the aperture size, while the tap symbolizes the shutter. You can let the same quantity of water flow into the bucket in different ways. When you reduce the diameter of the pipe, it takes longer to fill the bucket. Conversely, it doesn't take so long for the same quantity of water to flow into the bucket if you increase the diameter of the pipe. The quantity of water remains the same, only the filling method changes. The term exposure value is defined in the same way. This example makes it easy to understand the way different time-aperture combinations work and how they're used. There will be situations in which, in P mode for example, you need a different aperture setting for a different sharpness impression than that suggested by the camera. In this case, press the release button briefly to allow the camera to meter the focus and the exposure. If you now turn the dial clockwise, the shutter time is increased and the aperture value is correspondingly compensated so that the exposure value remains the same. For an exposure with shutter speed priority, you set the exposure time and the camera automatically selects the correct aperture. For this mode, set the program selection disk to S. Use the wheel to set the exposure time. A short exposure time freezes movements in the picture. Short exposure times are often employed in sport and child photography. With its sequential shooting function, the E500 offers a special feature for sport photographers. Sequential shots can be taken in the quality settings HQ and SQ until the high-speed memory card, such as the SanDisk Extreme 3 for example, is full. If you make the exposure time longer, moving subjects will be blurred. This is known as motion blur. Motion blur can be used as a style element, but unintentionally blurred pictures may also result from movement of the camera during the shot. In order to avoid blurring due to camera shake, simply keep to the following rule. The exposure time should never be longer than the inverse of the focal length with reference to a 35mm camera. As the standard focal length of the 4/3 system is 25mm, you only have to multiply the focal length of your E500 by a factor of 2 to find the equivalent focal length with reference to a 35mm camera. This sounds more complicated than it actually is. Here's an example. If your chosen focal length is 54mm, that is 108mm with reference to a 35mm camera, you should photograph with an exposure time of at least 1/100th of a second. If you stray into the critical camera shake range, use the program shift, the shutter speed priority, or increase the ISO sensitivity of the camera. You can also use the effect of movement blur for creative purposes. The intentional use of movement blur can produce interesting results. Movement is a sequence of single images. In photography, however, only one image is usually available to record a situation. Look at this picture of a fountain. As a result of the short exposure time used here, the water in the picture appears to be frozen. When a longer exposure time is used, as in the second picture, the water appears much more dynamic and lifelike. Compare the two pictures of the cars. Which of the vehicles is moving? The car in the picture on the right appears to be stationary, although it's moving relatively fast, while the picture on the left gives a more realistic impression of speed. This is achieved using the so-called panning effect. For this effect, you focus on your moving main motif and pan the camera with it while pressing the shutter release. Another important element of picture creation is the choice of aperture. The aperture of a camera is the equivalent of the pupil in a human eye. It not only regulates the quantity of incident light, but also has an influence on the depth of field in the image. You can control the aperture with the function Automatic Exposure with Aperture Priority. For this mode, set the program selection dial of your E500 to A and use the wheel to set the aperture. Smaller f numbers represent larger apertures and reduce the depth of field, while larger f numbers permit the sharp reproduction of both foreground and background. In a portrait, the person, being the important part of the picture, can be detached from the background by a shallow depth of field. When, on the other hand, in the case of a landscape photo, both foreground and background are to be sharp, a small aperture, that is, a large f number, is chosen. It's largely the deliberate choice of point of focus and depth of field which distinguishes a consciously composed picture from a snapshot. In addition to the aperture, there are other factors which influence the depth of field: the distance of the motif from the camera, the focal length of the lens. The shorter the distance of an object from the camera, the easier it is to achieve a narrow depth of field. It's fundamentally easier to realize a shallower depth of field with lenses of longer focal length than with those of shorter focal length. That's also the reason why telelenses are used for portrait photography, while wide-angle lenses are more often used for landscape photography. In macro photography, control of the depth of field can be a tricky matter. Because of the short distance between lens and object, sufficient depth of field can't always be achieved by moderate aperture reduction without making the exposure time very long. For a good exposure with short exposure times, the use of macro flash units, such as the ring flash unit RF11 or the twin flash unit TF22, is recommended. The color mood of a photo contributes greatly to the impression it makes. Your E500 is equipped with a white balance function to cover every color mood. The white balance does not refer only to the intensity of the light, but to the different color temperatures in different lighting situations. Normal daylight has a color temperature of about 5,600 degrees Kelvin. The light of a sunset or an electric light bulb has a color temperature of about 3,000 to 3,200 degrees Kelvin. Candlelight has an even lower color temperature of about 1,500 degrees Kelvin. An exception is fluorescent tubes, which mostly radiate a greenish or magenta light. It may seem strange at first to refer to daylight as blue or the light from fluorescent tubes as green, because we usually perceive both as neutral white. This is thanks to the adaptability of the human brain. This natural adaptability is not possessed by digital cameras. They have to be told what they should reproduce as neutral white. To be able to reproduce all the different color temperatures neutrally, digital cameras make use of the white balance. This defines what the camera is to reproduce as white. With the automatic white balance, the camera automatically scans the white in the motif and regulates the white balance accordingly. For most situations, the auto setting in the white balance menu is satisfactory. In certain lighting situations, it may be impossible to achieve a perfect white balance. It often happens that you have to take photos in mixed light situations, in which, for example, artificial light is mixed with daylight coming through a window. In this case, use instant white balance. In some light situations, it may well be a good idea to deviate from neutral colouring. You want to photograph an atmospheric sunset and to capture the warm golden shades in your picture. In this case, however, an automatic or preset white balance would show colours neutrally and calculate away the warm colouring. In order to preserve the warm mood, select a fixed white balance value from the menu higher than the actual colour temperature. The red tones will then no longer be filtered out, and the photo will correspond with your perception of the scene. In analog photography, films of different sensitivity are used to cope with the requirements of different lighting conditions. The different sensitivities are designated with ISO followed by a number. For example, ISO 100, ISO 200 or ISO 400. A film with ISO 200 is twice as sensitive as a film with ISO 100, and a film with ISO 400 is 4 times more sensitive to light. These designations have been adopted for digital photography and have characteristics similar to the different film sensitivities. The advantage of digital photography is that you don't have to wait until you finish the film of one sensitivity before you can insert another. You merely need to press your camera's ISO button and set the required sensitivity with the dial. Perhaps you've noticed the coarse grain in photos with high sensitivity films. There's a similar effect in digital photography, but this, of course, has a different cause than that when film is used. In the case of film, the coarse grain is caused by larger, more photosensitive crystals. When you increase the ISO sensitivity of a digital camera, you will see that different coloured pixels appear, particularly in the darker parts of the image. These randomly occurring pixels are known as noise. Noise is a special problem in the case of long exposures. In the E500's Record Menu 1, you will find the function Noise Reduction, which permits elimination of the noise. The exposure procedure in this case is doubled in duration, as the picture is taken once normally and once with the shutter closed in order to subtract the dark current noise from the final image. For many situations, it's sufficient to set the ISO value to auto. For extremely low light situations, you can extend the ISO range to ISO 1600 in the camera's setup menu. Bear in mind, though, that this increases the image noise. Increase the sensitivity, for example, if you do not want to use flash in order not to disturb the mood of your motif. A high ISO setting in conjunction with a built-in or attached flash unit increases its effective range. A higher ISO value can also be useful in sport photography, when you have to use short exposure times. The E500 possesses a built-in flash unit with guide number 13. The guide number of a flash unit provides information about its output and thus about its range. It's calculated as follows. Guide number equals aperture times distance. This means, for example, that at aperture 4, you can flash a little more than 3 meters with your camera's built-in flash unit. Guide number 13 equals aperture 4 times distance 3.25 meters. This equation, of course, can also be transposed according to the rules of mathematics, depending on what you want to calculate. As another example, let's take the system flash unit FL50 from Olympus, which has a guide number of 50. With this, you can flash further with the same aperture setting. Guide number 50 divided by aperture 4 equals 12.5 meters. The E500 possesses a number of very useful flash settings. In the auto setting, the flash unit flips up automatically according to the mode selected and also flashes automatically. The red eye effect reduction reduces the probability that the eyes of people photographed will appear red. The flash unit emits a series of preliminary flashes before the photo is taken, so that the pupils of the people being photographed have time to close and the effect is correspondingly reduced. The effect of the preliminary flash may be limited as pupil reaction time differs from person to person. A further possibility for reducing the red eye effect is the use of external flash units such as the FL20, FL36 and FL50, which, with the help of flash cables, can be moved away from the axis of the objective. This means that the light of the flash no longer goes directly into the eyes of the subject, and you can be more creative with the lighting. With the FL36 and the FL50, you can also flash indirectly, which leads to a softer illumination of the faces of portrait subjects. Don't think of the flash as just for lighting up dark surroundings. Fill-in flash is ideally suited for reducing the effect of harsh shadows in portraits taken in the sunshine, or for compensating any colour deviations which may occur with artificial lighting. In the case of night photos taken with flash, the shutter speed is mostly too fast to light the background adequately. For such situations, the E500 offers you the possibility of long exposure synchronization. Here, a slower shutter speed for a brighter background is combined with the flash for the foreground, and in this way a balanced exposure is achieved. The use of a tripod is recommended, however, because the longer exposure time may lead to camera shake. Normally, the flash is triggered directly after the opening of the shutter. When photographing moving objects, however, this produces an image which does not match our expectations and our idea of movement. But if the flash is not triggered until the second shutter curtain, the impression is given that the blurred parts of the image are being drawn behind the object, which makes the motion look more authentic. The composition of a picture is crucial in determining whether we find a photo mediocre or even boring, or whether it can rivet our attention. Often the main subject is simply placed in the centre of the picture, making it appear static and expressionless. This frequently happens when inexperienced photographers allow themselves to be seduced by the central point of focus and then simply press the shutter release without paying attention to the positioning of the subject. There's a simple rule, however, which will save you from falling into the same trap. The rule of thirds. Divide the picture vertically and horizontally into equal thirds. The 4 points where the lines intersect are ideal for the positioning of the main motif. Division of the picture into thirds can also be used for photos in portrait format, and thus for portraits as well. These imaginary grid lines also simplify the composition of landscape photographs. Avoid the horizon running exactly through the centre of the picture. If, for example, the main motif is a spectacular cloud formation, allow 2/3 of the picture for the sky. You can also play with sharpness and unsharpness. If, for example, you position part of the scene unsharp in the foreground, you will see how this can add life to your pictures and give them depth. The choice of focal length is also decisive for the impression made by a photo. The E-System from Olympus offers you an assortment of 16 announced digital lenses with which you can give full rein to your creativity. Wide-angle lenses open up space, while longer focal lengths compress the background. While today we mainly use zoom lenses with which we can bring objects closer or push them further away, It can be well worthwhile at first not to change the focal length, but to look for a position in which the focal length harmonizes with the outline of the picture. Pay attention to geometrical shapes or lines in your subjects. Is there anything that might lead the eye of the viewer through the picture? Or can you perhaps, by means of a deliberate diagonal, create a relationship between two elements of the picture? The way your photos are saved has an influence on their possibilities for later use. The E500 can be set to the following quality steps: SQ, HQ, SHQ, which are saved as JPEGs, and TIFF, RAW, RAW plus HQ, and RAW plus SHQ. If you want to work on the photos you have taken, it's advisable to save them first as TIFF, because if they're repeatedly saved as JPEG, the image quality deteriorates every time and artifacts are produced. A great advantage of the Olympus RAW format, ORF, is that it's a loss-free format, but requires less memory space than TIFF. What's more, using the Olympus Master software supplied, you can set parameters such as the white balance, for example, retrospectively. The optionally available Olympus Studio software represents a professional image processing tool with which you can view, organize, and edit your photos. We hope we've given you a broader insight into the possible uses of the E500, and wish you lots of fun with your Olympus E system. For more information, please visit our internet site at www.olympus-europa.com.